for your own knowledge. So we ask that you please keep your video turned off and your microphones muted during the course of the presentation. If for some reason you're having difficulty muting your microphone or turning off your video, I do have the capability to do that for you, and I may be checking and helping you out. But if you could do that on your end, it always gets it done sooner. This recording will be shared to the University of Illinois Extension's YouTube page once it's processed and closed captioned. So I'll share a link to that in the chat box here in a little while. And if you have any questions at that time, please feel free to type it into the chat and we'll address them at the end. I can find questions easier if some of you who know each other don't start having a conversation. That would help. Apologize for pulling a little bit of social time, but it makes it easier for me to find those questions at the end and get through as many as possible. Erin also has an evaluation. We ask you fill those out because we need those to continue programming, and we do get a lot of good ideas from those for future programs, as well as how much information you were able to retain and what you might do with that. So please consider that. It helps us tremendously. We'll share that link in the chat box now. And in case you can't stay for the whole presentation, and then we will again at the end. So I will pick that up. And Erin, while I'm doing that, I will turn it over to you to get started. Thank you, everyone.
Wonderful. Thank you, Peggy. And good afternoon, everyone. Like Peggy said, my name is Erin Garrett, and I am an Extension Educator in Energy and Environmental Stewardship. I'm going to switch my slide there. So I am based in Union County in Southern Illinois, and I serve the southernmost 5 counties in Illinois. I'm also a member of Illinois Extension's statewide Smart Grid Outreach team, and our team has been working to bring consumer education on the benefits of the upgrades that are happening to our electric grid throughout the state and throughout the country. And some of these benefits have allowed for the increased ease of connecting renewable sources of electricity to that grid, like solar. So today, we're going to be exploring solar energy as a possibility for your home. Okay. So just to give a brief overview of what we're going to be covering today, we're going to start with a basic background on how solar works. We're going to discuss a few different options for homeowners who want to install panels on their property. And then we're going to focus the majority of the webinar on which questions you should be thinking about if you're considering solar. So to make this a little bit more concrete and relatable, we're going to go through a couple of examples of some homes considering installing solar arrays as we go through those questions. And then we're going to kind of assess if those proposed projects seem feasible and cost effective. Okay, so if we start in general thinking about why do we want to consider renewable energy, we can take a large scale or a broader community look and see that, you know, our coal and gas-fired power plants are continuing to contribute to greenhouse gas emissions, and our dependence on those fossil fuels is not a long-term solution. So renewable energy really is a growing field, and it's a great place to be moving towards in the future. Now, one piece of legislation that if you get into the solar world, you'll hear a lot about is something called the Future Energy Jobs Act, also known as FEJA. And this act does a lot of great things for renewable energy, but there are a few relevant parts that I want to point out that are relevant for you and me as, you know, homeowners considering putting solar on our home. So the first piece of this is the act mandates that a quarter or 25% of electricity coming from the main power companies in Illinois, Ameren and ComEd, needs to be coming from renewable sources by the year 2025. And the second piece is that this act requires that we create over 4,000 megawatts of new solar and wind power in Illinois by the year 2030. So when you put these two pieces together, what has happened in recent years is it's become a lot easier and more feasible for private landowners, small businesses, nonprofits to be installing solar because it helps to meet these goals. If we look on the small scale, solar can be an economically viable option for many individuals, and that's something that we will be diving into today. On the other hand, offsetting some of your own electricity needs if you go solar can help reduce demand on the whole electric grid, which can result in a more reliable and affordable system for all customers. And there may be some of you on the call today that are also considering wanting to go off the grid and be completely self-sustaining. We're going to talk about the pros and cons of that choice today, and also talk about pros and cons of choosing a grid-tied system. And we'll talk about what those terms mean as we keep going as well. Okay. Before we move any further, I do want to break down some of the terms that you may hear when it comes to solar. So first of all, a whole solar system can also be referred to as a solar array. And I'll use those terms interchangeably throughout this presentation. So if we look at this picture, everything in this photo makes up the solar array. The array includes individual panels, that's the term we're used to hearing, but panels are also called modules. So panels and modules, and I will outline in red an individual panel or module here. And then the panels or modules are comprised of cells. So again, I'll outline a single cell. Another term that you're going to hear in conjunction with solar is photovoltaic, or simply PV. And so you may hear these referred to as PV arrays, photovoltaic panels, PV cells. All of that just refers to the conversion of light into electricity. So this PV array is a way to take sunlight and convert it into electricity. Now, as we keep going, we're going to take just a short refresher course in how solar panels work. We're going to keep it pretty basic just to get everyone up to speed and on the same page. So those modules contain photovoltaic cells. And the modules as a whole, including those cells, are made up of a bunch of different layers, okay? We can see some of those layers in this diagram. So on the top of our modules, we have a layer of glass. That's gonna help protect the panels from all the elements of being outside. They have an anti-reflective coat. And then the important pieces we're gonna focus on are the layers called semiconductors. Okay, and the semiconductors include two different layers of silicon. One layer of silicon has some phosphorus in it, which creates a negative charge, and one layer contains boron, which creates a positive charge. If we think back to our middle school science days, hopefully we know where this is going, but when photons from the sunlight are able to hit that solar panel, they're able to excite the electrons, which are going to want to move towards the positive side. It's more complicated than this, but we'll keep it right there and just say as that movement is happening, metallic wires through the cells are able to catch that generated current. Now, it's important to note that the current that is generated is direct current, or DC power. So now we've created our current and we step out to look at our whole system or array. Okay, so now we have those modules or panels on the roof. They're converting the sun's energy into electricity. They've generated direct current, or DC, and then that's going to move through a piece called an inverter. And an inverter is where that electricity is converted from DC to AC. So then it is in an alternating current, so it can be used in our home to power our electric devices. Then that electricity is going to move through your electric meter, your breaker box, everything else just like normal, okay? Again, this is a simplified picture of how it works, but just to make sure we're all kind of on the same page. Okay, I really like to include this picture because while it seems like solar arrays are relatively simple, there's still a bunch of pieces that are required to make them work properly. And this photo shows kind of behind the scenes of that solar array that we typically don't see, right? We're used to just seeing panels, but there are a bunch of other pieces that's important to be aware of are required to make the system work properly. So again, we're going to need those modules. We're going to need some type of mounting rack, and we will talk about ground mounted options and roof mounted options in a few slides. You're going to need wires, of course, PV wire, in order to move your electricity. You're going to need something called a combiner box, which is going to take all of the generated currents from each of those panels and combine them together so it's able to go through the inverter. We have options with inverters that we'll talk about as well. In most cases, you're going to need a bidirectional electric meter. And in some cases, you may want to consider adding on batteries if you want to have your own electricity storage and potentially go off the grid. Now, in many cases with our advancing technology, batteries are kind of that limiting factor right now, and that's still kind of the case with home solar. So we'll dive a little bit into batteries, but not too much today. So the next thing I want to do is just point out a few of the different options that are out there when it comes to the types of modules that are out there, mounting racks, and inverters. And this isn't to say one is better than the other or to recommend one over the other, but just to make you aware and more comfortable with some of the different options that are out there. So if you do go and get a quote from a solar installer, you're familiar with the lingo and you're able to differentiate, why they chose maybe this certain system and said that was best for your home, and just so you're a little bit more informed. So when it comes to different types of solar panels or modules, there's three main types: monocrystalline, polycrystalline, and thin film. And the first two are the ones that are suitable for residential arrays. And they mostly differ in the way that they are manufactured. So the monocrystalline is cut from a single crystal of silicon. It has the highest efficiency, but also the highest cost because of how it's produced. Polycrystalline is also a great choice. It just differs because it's made from fragments instead of that pure crystal. So because of that, their efficiency is a little bit lower, and then their cost is also a little bit lower. Both of those are great options though, so depending on how much space you have available, you might be able to go with a slightly less efficient solar panel that still meets your needs and maybe saves you a little bit of money. The last option is thin film, and I just point this out. It is the least efficient, and often it's used in commercial applications when you have, say, a very large building that has a ton of flat roof space, and they're able to just lay this thin film down, and the fact that it's a lot less efficient doesn't matter as much because they have a huge amount of area in order to generate electricity from. Okay. So let's look at different types of mounting racks. We can have a ground mount or a roof mount, and this is going to depend on where you live and your preference. One or the other might not even be feasible. So a ground mount is going to require you to have the space for that setup in an area that is, somewhat close to your home, but is not affected by shading. Okay, and there are specifications on what angle you'd want to put those panels at. They're often stationary, but they can be movable. So in some cases, you can change the angle of those panels based on the seasons. Sometimes there are ones that can track the sun throughout the day. But just keep in mind that if you add moving parts, your system cost is going to increase, as well as your risk for having those parts break and need to be repaired. So keeping that in mind when we talk about operation and maintenance costs is going to be important. Many homeowners opt for a roof mount, and let me get a picture of one of those up here. And there are a whole bunch of different setups depending on the type of roof that you have. So anywhere from shingle or tile roofs, even metal roofs. I like this picture because these tiles, the mounting racks actually have metal pieces that are in the same shape as the tiles. And so they simply replace the tile with that metal piece that's attached to the mounting racks and then are able to put those panels up. One factor to keep in mind with a roof mount, which we'll talk about later, is the age and current condition of your roof, because you want to make sure that you're not putting up a system that's going to be up there for, about 20, 25 years and need to replace your roof halfway through. We'd want to make sure we get that done first. Okay. And then I do want to spend some time talking about inverters. And I realize this is a lot of information on this page, but hopefully if we just look and focus on the graphics, it will help illustrate the point really well. So remember, the inverter is the piece that is going to convert that DC power to AC so that what you're generating in your modules can be usable in your home. And the three options that we have is something called a string inverter, we have microinverters, and then we have a string inverter with optimizers. And you can see by the dollar signs that they range in price. So how it works with the string inverter is basically all of your modules or panels are all connected to one central inverter. Okay, this is our least expensive option. The problem with this one is if you do have any shading, say early morning shading on one or two of your panels, it's going to reduce the performance of your entire system because they're all connected to that one inverter. Another downside to these inverters is they're not rapid shutdown ready. Now, rapid shutdown, if you're not familiar, was added to the electric code a few years ago. And what it does is it provides an easy way for firefighters to basically de-energize a solar system in case of an emergency where they would have to be working around your solar panels or get on your roof. In the case of the string inverters, even if you turn the inverter off, the DC wiring can still have electricity flowing through it, if the sun is shining. So they've worked a way around this. There's an add-on that you can purchase in order to make your system up to electrical code, but that is something to be aware of that you will need to add on to your system. If we look at the opposite end of the spectrum, we can have microinverters. It is the priciest option, but in this case, each panel has its own miniature inverter on it. So this means that if you had any shading, say on one or two panels, it's only going to impact that panel's performance individually. They are manufactured to be rapid shutdown ready, so you don't have to have any add-ons, and they're very easy to install. And then we can look at kind of our middle ground option. There's something called a string inverter with optimizers. This is going to allow for more panel level monitoring that's able to handle shade, and it is rapid shutdown ready. However, with this option, it is a little bit harder to install. So this is where if you want that panel level monitoring, it might be worth it to go with the microinverters. But again, all of this is just to keep these options in mind. Depending on the size of your system, how many panels you have, microinverters might be the way to go. It might not be too much more of an expense for you. So just keeping these options in mind, especially if you are getting quotes, so that you're understanding which is the best system for you. Okay, so now that we've gone through some of the options for those pieces, let's talk about the two main solar connection options that we have. We can either have a grid-tied system or an off-the-grid system. So non-residential off-grid systems are pretty common. You may be familiar with seeing, an electric fence powered by a solar panel, a street light powered by a solar panel. Maybe there is a water pumping system on a farm, like in this picture here, powered by solar panels, or even those blinking stoplights that have the small panel. So these systems only provide electricity when the sun is shining. If you wanted to use electricity at another time, you'd need to store that energy with batteries. So again, like I mentioned earlier, at this point, batteries are a large investment that may not necessarily pay off in a significant return when it comes to home solar operations. Now, if we look into the future, we might have a very different story. But at this point in time, due to those cost constraints, most people are going to go with a grid-tied system. So let's look at those systems. This involves connecting your solar array to the existing electric grid. And this is going to allow you to use both the electricity you generate from your solar array as it's being produced, but then also draw off the grid during times such as at night or on cloudy days when you're not generating your own electricity from your solar array. So in this situation, the utility grid is going to serve as your backup resource. And so when you connect your solar panels up to the existing electric grid, your renewable energy is able to be counted in those goals that were included in FEJA, as we mentioned in the beginning, because essentially you're acting as a small producer of renewable energy. So we can see in the diagram here that you can both produce electricity from your solar panels that will power your household appliances, but also draw off the grid. Now, you also can send excess electricity back to the grid, say you produced more than you used, and we'll talk about how that works as we move on to our next slide. So when you connect your solar array to the electrical grid, that's called interconnection, and it is required for a grid-tied system. That makes sense. And it requires you to have a bidirectional meter on your home, so you can both use electricity you generate as well as electricity from the grid. Now, something called net metering may then be available for your system through your electricity provider. And this is what happens when excess electricity you produce is going to offset your next electricity bill. Now, the rules and regulations and availability and all of that varies based on your electricity provider. So make sure if you are considering solar that you figure out what that net metering policy is. The example we're going to focus on today is set up that if you produce more electricity than you use in a given month, you'll receive a bill credit at a certain rate for that excess on the following month. So one thing you should keep in mind is you should not approach solar with the idea of generating excess electricity to earn extra money. We really want you to produce what you need and then benefit maybe 1 to 3 months out of the year from a small cost savings by generating a little bit of excess. And we'll look at how that works a little bit later in the presentation as well. But while we're talking about meters, net metering, this is a good time to mention the smart meter upgrade that's been happening for the past few years across the country. So our electrical grid as a whole has been receiving an upgrade, and part of that has been the installation of a smart meter. So hopefully you know if you have a new smart meter, a new digital meter on your home, and they're able to record daily and hourly energy usage. And this technology is really key with solar because it's able to help track what you're generating at home if you have a solar array and what you're using from the grid. Smart meters also are really great because they indicate your electricity service status. So if there's a power outage, like many of us experienced recently, that meter would alert the power company right away for you, so you don't have to do that. So this new grid upgrade has made it a lot easier to connect renewables up to like your home solar operation. So let's look at what this might look like as we move into the future with this new smart technology. This diagram is showing a home that has a grid-tied solar system. So they're connected to that smart grid. You can see that they are charging their electric vehicle using that solar power they're generating. They do have batteries in their home. They've got an advanced smart meter, and they've even got a smart thermostat in their home. So we're not quite at this point yet, but this is kind of where the world is moving and could be, you know, a scenario as we look a few decades into the future here. Okay. So now we're going to shift our focus to asking some questions and trying to figure out if solar might be a good option for your home. So we're going to dive into some of the factors that go into considering solar, including sizing the system appropriately, assessing your site, considering the overall cost, understanding what incentives are available, and then we're just going to touch a little bit on hiring, contracting, permitting, and insurance. Now, as we go through these questions, we're going to look at 2 examples that I'm going to present shortly. And I do just want to point out that I have been using a modeling software called SAM, or the System Advisor Model. And so when you see some numbers and figures and graphs in here, those have come from that modeling system. Now, that program is free. And if you were interested in diving into that yourself, feel free to send me an email at the end of this presentation and I can give you some information on that. But just so you know, as we're moving through this, I wanted to be upfront with you on where that information is coming from. Okay, so let's set up our two examples. So our first example is going to be a home located in Southern Illinois. This home has a 1,900 square foot roof that's mostly north and south facing, and it does have some shading. The portion included in the picture here is the south facing portion of the roof that would be available for them for solar. Okay, so first example number one is going to be the home in Southern Illinois. Example number two, with this really great aerial shot, is a home in Northern Illinois. And in this case, they have an east and west facing roof. Two of the northern corners get a little bit of shading, and their roof is going to measure about 1,500 square feet. And we can see that all of that open space that's unshaded is available for solar. Okay, so example number two is a home in Northern Illinois. So we'll keep those in mind as we keep going. So when it comes to properly sizing a solar system, the first thing you need to do is determine your goals, okay? So why do you want solar? And these are not mutually exclusive. They can overlap. You can have more than one goal. But depending on which goal you prioritize, it might shift how large of a system you want or where your priorities lie. So is your main motivation primarily environmental? Do you want to go green and make your own electricity, and even if it costs a little bit more, you're willing to make that sacrifice, and that's the route you want to go? Are you coming from a purely economical standpoint and you say, I think it makes financial sense for me to install solar, so I want to do it if it makes sense financially? Do you want to be that one house in the neighborhood that has solar panels and you want to put them up there for an aesthetic reason? Or maybe you live in a rural area that doesn't have the best reliable electricity and you want to improve that for yourself. So depending on which goals you have and which you prioritize, that will be important as we continue moving through. Okay, so in general, our guideline that we're going to go by is that it's better to under-generate rather than over-generate. And we'll talk about that as we continue moving through the presentation. But a starting point, a good place to start, is to generate between 50 and 75% of your load. That might seem a little bit lower than you initially were thinking, but that's going to play a role when we get into net metering and why we'd want to under-generate rather than over-generate. One thing to keep in mind is you definitely don't want to exceed 110% generation, so you don't want to produce more than 110% of your home's annual usage because there can be net metering limits of your utility, and your status as a homeowner with a solar array may change to where they're considering you to be a producer and different rules will apply. So make sure, again, that you fully read and understand all of the policies that go with your specific utility company. But let's look at two examples of annual electricity usage for our two homes. So we've got on the left electricity usage for the home in Southern Illinois, home number one. We can see that their monthly usage ranges from the upper 800 kilowatt hours up to even over 2,000 this past July. On average, that home uses about 16,000 kilowatt hours per year. Our home in our second example has the electricity usage on the right side, the right chart here. Their electricity usage is much lower. They range in the 300s up to maybe 900 kilowatt hours per month. So on average, they use about 5,700 kilowatt hours. So right away, it's important to note that these two different homes have drastically different energy demands. And so it's really important to size your solar array for your home and your electricity usage. You know, you can look online and see recommendations on how large of a system the average homeowner needs, but really you need to look at your own electricity usage and determine that number for yourself. So that annual electricity usage is going to serve as the baseline for your system size. And if you're able to look back through your electric bill records and kind of average that data over at least 2 years, that will give you a better idea of your electricity usage. And that's what I did for those 2 homes. Their average annual usage, I took that data over a couple years just to make sure we didn't have, you know, an abnormally warm year that caused an increase in their electricity usage one year. Okay, another thing to keep in mind is to ask yourself if you've taken other steps to improve your energy efficiency first and reduce your electricity usage. So in the case of that first home that uses that 16,000 kilowatt hours a year, some other facts about that house is it's almost 150 years old. It still has some very large, old, outdated windows that aren't sealed the best. The insulation isn't really that great. So in that case of that home, I would encourage that homeowner to get an energy audit and see maybe if they should invest a little bit of money into improving the efficiency of how their home uses electricity first before they consider solar. Okay. The next step, once we have our annual electricity usage, is to determine what % of your usage you want to be provided by solar based on your goals. Okay, this is going to be a starting point. It may shift as we move through and consider some other aspects and some other questions. And then you also want to consider if you want to store energy, if you do want to put that investment in to get batteries. So let's look at what our examples are going to do. Example 1, again, they use 16,000 kilowatt hours. Let's just say they're going to ignore my advice and not get an energy audit. And because their usage is so high, they're just going to go for about 50%. That's their goal. So about 8,000 kilowatt hours a year. And they're not going to consider storage. Home 2, remember their usage was just under 6,000 kilowatt hours annually. They're going more for that environmentally conscious, even if it's a little more expensive, because they use so much less electricity, they really want to try to maximize how much electricity they can generate themselves. So they're going to go for 75% at a little over 4,000 kilowatt hours, again, without any storage. Okay, so those are based on our goals. That's what we're going to try to achieve. Now, something that you may have noticed if you've looked up anything about the size of solar arrays for the home, those arrays are sized in kilowatts, or we can call it kW. But we just saw that we measure our electricity in kilowatt hours. So kilowatts are a measure of power, kilowatt hours is a measure of energy. So we need to find a way to figure out, based on our goals and how much kilowatt hours we want to produce, what size system we would need. And again, we're doing this so that you have an idea based on your home's energy usage before you go to get a quote, and you have an idea of how large of a system or small of a system you think fits your home. Okay, so there's a very simple calculation that you can do that we're going to go through on the next slide. And one factor that we need to take into consideration is the number of hours of sunlight that your home is going to get per day. So we can get that from a map like this one here. It's going to tell us the peak number of sun hours that we get in a day. So let's look at this map and figure out those values for our 2 homes. So our first example is in Southern Illinois in this light orange range here. And it might be difficult to see on the chart, but their peak sun hours in a day is going to range from 4.25 to 4.5 hours per day. Now they're really close to the next color, so we're just going to say 4.5 hours for this home. Our Northern Illinois home is way up here in a different color zone, so they're going to range from 4 to 4.25 hours per day. Again, they're kind of on the upper end of that range, so we're going to say 4 hours per day. Okay, so 4.5 and 4. So let's go through this equation to get an estimate of what size system, okay? I promise we're going to step through it. Stick with me, we'll get there. So for our first home, example number 1, we're trying to figure out what size system, so we're going to leave that part blank. The next piece that we need is that number of peak sun hours in a day. For that Southern Illinois home, that was 4.5 hours. Next, we're going to multiply that by the number of days in a year, 365. And then we need to account for the fact that when you take a solar panel and you put it outside, it's not going to perform at the same level that it will under standard operating conditions. So we basically just need to reduce its performance by about 20%. So we're going to say it's going to perform at about 80% of its capacity, okay? And then we're going to put in that number from our goals of how much electricity we want to produce per year. So for that first home, it was 8,000 kilowatt hours per year, okay? So all we're going to do is we're going to multiply 4.5 by 365 by 0.8. We'll take 8,000 divided by that value. And to meet our production goals, we'll need about a 6.1 kW system. Okay, we're going to go through our second example. So again, we don't know what size system we need. They had only 4 peak sun hours in a day, same number of days in the year, same reduction of panel performance, and remember they wanted just over 4,300 kilowatt hours per year. We'll do that math again, and in this case, for example 2, to meet their goal, they need a 3.7 kW system. Okay, so again, we have 2 different examples, 2 different annual kilowatt hour usages, 2 different goals, okay, 2 different locations. All of that is going to alter the size of the systems that we are looking for here, okay? So now that we have an idea of the size of our system that we want, we need to do a site assessment and see, is that size system even going to fit? So our next questions to ask are, if you wanted that ground or roof mount, okay? If you want a roof mount, how old is your roof? How big is your roof? What direction is it facing? You can have panels that are facing different directions, like in this picture here. Now that gets a little bit too complicated for me personally in modeling, so I kept it simple. You want to consider the direction and tilt of those panels as well. And then if you have any shading. Now, if you do have some shading part of the day, you don't have to completely rule out that location for those panels. You know, if you had some early morning shading or some late afternoon shading, you can still really benefit from having solar in that location. So don't discount it completely right away. So one really great way to do a site assessment is to use this tool called PV Watts Calculator. And basically how it works is you type in the address and it's going to pull weather data based on your location. And then you can either put in the size system that you want, like we calculated, or you can draw out the area of the roof and it will tell you what size system will fit in that spot. So let's go through that for our examples. Example 1, they wanted a 6.1 kW system. This aerial image here is from the PV Watts calculator, and you can see that picture that I showed of that area of the roof that is suitable for solar. I outlined it here, and it told me that it could only fit a 4 kW system in that area. So in the case of this home, we're not going to be able to meet the goal for the size system that they want based on the characteristics of their house. But we're still going to take this example through all the way. Other things to note with this house is it has a 17-year-old shingle roof, so we'd want to make sure that they got that replaced before they did their solar installation. Okay, for example 2, their goal was 3.7 kW. They have a 19-year-old shingle roof, so same situation with them. We'd want to make sure that that roof is ready to go for another 20 years before we put solar on it. They have enough space for a 10 kW system on both the east and west side of their home. Now that would be very, very heavy, so that would be too large of a system for that house, but they do have ample amounts of space to meet that 3.7 kW goal, and they would be able to put it on the southern side of the roof so that any of that shading from those trees on the north side wouldn't be a factor. Now, if you do get into the PV Watts calculator, I do want to point out a couple things. It will also give you a cost value dollar amount, and I just want to caution you against using that as a gauge because it really doesn't take all the complex factors that go into the financial side into account. So if you do use that calculator, use it as a way to size the system and to estimate how many kilowatt hours it'll produce, but don't look at the cost side of it as a good estimate. Okay, so speaking of cost, let's start moving into exploring this side of things. So while the sun is free, we know electricity from it is not free. Solar systems are an investment, but it's also important to note that the majority of the cost of a solar array is not equipment, but rather installation, operation and maintenance, taxes, and all these other costs that we can categorize as soft costs. So in this graph from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, you can see how the price of solar has decreased from the year 2010. And this is the latest data that is available. The 2020 report should be coming out soon. But what this shows is a good estimate. This is a general estimate for residential solar across the United States. And it says that per watt of your system, it should cost about $2.70. Now remember, we measured our system in kilowatts, so that's about $2,700 per kW of your system. Again, depending on where you live, solar costs are going to vary. This is definitely not a hard and fast number, but it serves as that baseline so that if you did, get a quote back and it was way off, you'd be able to look into where those costs, what's driving that up. Is it these other soft costs or is it, the hardware? So if we use this as a baseline for our two examples, example one, based on their roof size, they can only do a 4 kW system. So using our 2,700 per kW, it's going to be about $10,800 as our baseline, right? For example number two, we're going to simplify it a little bit and make it a 3.5 kW system. And based on some math, that's going to be about $9,450. So again, this is a starting point, a good comparison. This will help you feel a little bit more comfortable going into getting a solar quote because you have a ballpark idea of what it's going to cost, and that number is just not going to come out of the blue. Okay, so we're going to break down costs a little bit more. Always keeping in mind what you can afford in the back of your mind. We want to find out if our system's going to eventually pay for itself. We want to make sure we're aware of any incentives. We're going to talk about two incentives today, but if you really want to dive into that and see what's available in your area, I encourage you to check out this database at desireusa.org. You can search by state and by location, and there's a whole bunch of information on that website. We want to keep in mind that your utility may charge you a fee to interconnect your system, say a few $100s. You want to check and make sure if net metering is available and what that rate is. And then always keep in mind that a portion of your energy bill is a fixed cost. So if you are tied to the grid, you'll still pay, some of those taxes and some of those customer charges and meter charges, regardless of how much solar you generate in a month. A few other notes: make sure you review your project with a utility representative, perhaps an accountant and even an attorney prior to making a decision. We want to have multiple people looking at this before you make this investment. And also keep in mind the system lifetime. So your solar panels are going to be warranted generally at about 25 years, but inverters may need to be replaced at 10 or 15 years. So we also need to be thinking about operation and maintenance costs and putting those into our budget. Okay, so let's focus on two main incentives. And the first incentive is called the Federal Investment Tax Credit. And this credit allows you to deduct, in this current year, in 2020, you can deduct 26% of your solar project costs from your federal taxes. Now, this tax credit was put in place to kind of jumpstart the solar installation industry, and they have been reducing that rate each year as we go. So if we look to what's going to be the rate next year in 2021, it's going to be reduced to 21% of those costs. With this tax credit, it does not depend on how much energy your system produces, but you must pay federal taxes to benefit from this. Okay, so that's our first big incentive. And our next incentive is something called solar renewable energy credits, or SRECs. You may also hear them referred to simply as RECs. And it's really important with SRECs, if you're not in Illinois, to check and see if they're available in your state and what their rate is. Each program is administered differently, and they each have different values at this point. So in Illinois, the program's called Illinois Shines. It's a state administered program, and it is an adjustable block program. So it is something that you have to apply to get into, and depending on the time of year that you get into the program, the value of those SRECs is going to vary, okay? So how it works is there's an incentive amount that's predetermined by how much energy your system is expected to produce over 15 years. So one SREC, you get one SREC per 1,000 kilowatt hours your system is expected to produce. And this will make more sense once we go through our examples. And then that amount is paid back over the first 5 years of that system. Now, when I've worked with a solar installer before and gotten a quote, they were going to handle the SREC process themselves. So they were going to put the application in, they calculated that amount for me, but it's important that you check with them and see, you know, who's going to be responsible for this. Is it coming through them? Is it supposed to come through you? Just make sure you ask those questions, and you can always get more information on the Illinois Shines website. Illinois is in a pretty good spot with their SRECs. The last numbers I looked at, depending on where you got in on the adjustable block, it was between $70 and $85 per SREC. In some other states, the SREC value is at, say, only $5 per SREC. So we're in a good spot right now with that. So let's move through our examples, okay? For example 1, we had a 4 kW system, and we can see that's expected to produce about 5,500 kilowatt hours per year. When we multiply that by 15 years, it's going to be about 83,000 kilowatt hours. We take that amount divided by that 1,000, and we get 83 SRECs. Okay, those 83 SRECs, if we go conservative and say we're on the lower end of that block and get $70 per SREC, it's going to be about $5,800, which divided over 5 years would be about $1,100 each year. Okay, so I apologize if that was quick, but simple math that we did to get that value, okay? Going through example 2, again, we can see expected just under 4,000 kilowatt hours per year times those 15 years is going to be about 59,000 kilowatt hours. Divide that by 1,000 to get 59 SRECs times that $70. It's going to be about $4,100 that they can get back, or $826 over 5 years. Okay, so that's a big chunk. But remember, it is something you have to apply to get into, and you will have to pay for your solar system up front, okay? So with that federal investment tax credit and these SRECs, you still may need to take out a loan in order to have that initial investment up front. Okay, let's take a look at net metering really quick. And this is where you can receive those on-bill credits from your electric utility. And here's an example of a bill for a home that has solar. And in this case, they only generated about 461 kilowatt hours from their system, but they used 1297. So on this bill, how it works is the power company just subtracts how much you generated from the total amount you used, and then they use that difference to calculate your bill, okay? So in this case, remember, when you pay for electricity, you're paying for the supply cost, the supply cost and the delivery cost. So you put those together, and it can range, you know, anywhere 8 to 12 cents per kilowatt hour, depending on where you live. So you get that full value back if you're under generating. If you over generate, they're going to credit you at a lower rate for that over generation. Usually, you know, 3 to 5 cents, but maybe even lower. So let's look at what that looks like in a solar array. Now, the next slide has a lot of information on it, but we're going to go through it, and I promise it will help make sense. So what I did is I have 4 different graphs here, and this is modeled for our home in Northern Illinois, that smaller system. So I modeled a 2 kW system, 3, 4, and 5. I realize you can't read the axes on these graphs, and that's okay. What this is showing is the monthly electricity demand of that house in the gray bars. So the gray bars are all the same height. That shows how much electricity that home uses on average in each month of the year. The blue bars are how much that home would be expected to generate through their solar panels based on the size of their system. So as we move from the 2 to the 3 kW system, we can see those blue bars are taller in height. Okay, as they move from 3 to 4, they're even taller, and 4 to 5 even taller. Now there's a light blue bar on there, and we're going to ignore that one. Okay. I also included the different cost of these systems. Remember, another $2,700 for each additional kilowatt that we add on to size that system. So our goal with solar is to try to maximize the amount of electricity that we're generating in each month without going over. So in this first one, this 2 kW, you can see we're under generating in every month. Our blue bars are always lower than our gray. But we still have some space where maybe we could have a slightly larger system that produces a little bit more electricity. So if we step to our 3 kW system, you can see we produce more electricity from our panels. We only have 1 month where we go over, okay? In this 1 month, we're gonna get a bill credit for that excess electricity generation. So we generated about 50 kilowatt hours excess, and if we say that net metering rate is at 5 cents per kilowatt hour, this year you would have gotten $2.50 back through net metering because we only overgenerated in 1 month. If we go up to the next size, we can see we overgenerate in 3 months here. Taking that total together, we had 350 kilowatt hours excess, but that only totals to about $17.50, and we stepped up that system by a whole investment of another $2,700. And just to really bring this home, I did the 5 kW to show we have a lot of excess here, and it really only amounts to a bill credit of about $35 per year. So this is where the idea that if you size up your system to be way more than you need and you think you're going to make money from that net metering policy, it really is just a small amount of dollars that you get back. And so it really doesn't work in that way. Okay, so something to keep in mind, we'd want to be somewhere between 3 and 4 in this case. A little bit of net metering is okay, but that initial investment in a larger size system is not really going to result in a return in this case. Okay. I mentioned this before, but make sure you look at your electricity bill and understand where your fixed charges are, as outlined in red here on this example bill. And those are charges that you're going to pay every month no matter what if you have a grid-tied system. The ones in green are going to vary based on how much of your own electricity you're able to generate versus what you draw from the grid. Okay. A couple other notes with hiring and contracting. If you want to move forward with getting some quotes, check and make sure the contractor you choose is licensed, and look for someone with certifications in solar installation. So there's a bunch of different resources out there, but I like to look on the North American Board of Certified Energy Practitioners website, which is at this link here, www.nabcep.org. Okay. Also, just want to mention, you should make sure and check and see if you need a permit from your municipality or county. Understand if there's a fee involved, how long that process is going to take. Make sure you check and see if you need additional insurance. Some homeowner insurance policies already include solar panels, and your utility in some cases may require you to have insurance on your system, say up to $1 million of coverage, okay? So making sure we understand all of those pieces. So as we're wrapping up today, let's ask that big question. Is this project cost effective? So if we first look at that home in Southern Illinois, I think we know the answer on this one. Remember, their annual electricity usage was 16,000 kilowatt hours. They could only fit a 4 kW system, which is only going to generate about 35% of their load. So we're not even getting close to that 50 to 70% goal where we want to be. And we can see that in that graph on the bottom right, that the blue bars are really short, so they're really under generating for their home. We can see the cost breakdown in the top right corner for what it would cost them. And if we look at what their electric bill would be without solar, what it currently is, $1,350 a year. With solar, just under $1,000. So they're only saving, $374 a year on their electric bill. They wouldn't get benefits from net metering because they're never over generating in any of those months. And their estimated payoff timeline is going to be about 13.5 years. Now, this number is important to point out because this payback period is the amount of time it takes for all of your annual savings to equal your annual costs. So it's accounting for everything from the value of electricity generated by your system, installation and operating costs, incentives, income taxes, and so on and so forth. So sometimes you'll get a solar quote and they'll say you'll have, a 3 to 5 year payoff. And those really aren't necessarily the most realistic numbers. So keep that in mind. Something around, 8 to 12 years is much more realistic. Okay, remember this home would have had to get a new roof too. We didn't add that into that amount. And really they should probably work on better insulating and weatherizing their home first. So we're not gonna say that this home is a good fit for solar. But let's look at our second home in Northern Illinois. We can go through those numbers again, 5750 kilowatt hours. A 3.5 kW system is going to generate about 69% of their load. So their goal was about 75%. This size system would get them about 69%, so that's not too bad. It would cost them about $9,400. We can compare their electric bill. In this case, it's getting close to cutting half off of it per year. We can see in the graph on the right that they get net metering in a couple months, so a few dollars off their electric bill, and their estimated payoff timeline is about 12.5 years. In this case, this home is looking pretty good for solar, okay? So I would encourage them to start getting a few quotes. If you do get solar quotes, make sure you get more than one. Remember, those soft costs is a lot of that charge, so you want to make sure you get multiple quotes and compare and make sure you're getting the best deal. But I definitely encourage these homeowners to look into solar. So as we wrap up our hour today, in summary, in the right circumstances, solar can help meet your energy needs while saving money and energy. There's many questions to ask and factors to consider. I hope I didn't cloud your brains today, but helped you think about maybe some questions that you hadn't considered before. Keep in mind there are many incentives available, and make sure you always get more than one quote. So as we wrap up today, I do want to mention our next webinar in the Everyday Environment series will be on watershed planning, and it will be next month on September 10th at 1 p.m. with Jennifer Jones. So if you haven't signed up for that one yet, make sure you consider signing up for that today. And at this point, I have a QR code on the screen. If you would take a moment, as Peggy mentioned at the beginning, to take our evaluation. This program is a new program, so any feedback is greatly appreciated. You could also go to the link there that hopefully will get posted in the chat box for you. And I will be following up today with an email as well. So if you just want to wait for the email to get the link in the QR code, you can do that as well. So with that, I want to thank everyone for being on here today. And Peggy, if we have any questions in the chat box, we do have a few minutes left.
We do, and I already did post the evaluation link. You can just click
Perfect.
on that, the registration for next month, and the link so you can find the recording. But like Erin said, she'll be sending out a follow-up email as well. But the evaluations are our most interested piece of those things. So there were a few good questions, and that was great clarification, because I've heard other people talk about it before, but I got to tell you, each time you hear stuff, it starts to settle. But I like how you stair-stepped and made it one thing at a time. So that was fantastic. First of all, and it came to mind for me, Kate asked about home value, if you had heard anything about when it comes time for selling a home. And then she was also, with all the storms we've had, asked about how strong they are as far as putting up with hail damage.
Yeah, those are really great questions and ones that we hear a lot. So when it comes to increasing or decreasing home value, studies haven't shown any trends at all. So in general, it hasn't increased home value and it hasn't decreased home value. So I guess that's good. But really, it depends on the buyer. So it depends on, the area that you live in. If you live in an area that is a lot more environmentally conscious, it might increase your home value. But really, it's going to match the people that are looking at the home. So not really an overall trend that has been detected yet. And then when it comes to hail, I don't have the exact numbers of the amount of force that panels can withstand, but they are designed to, not just break when there's a hailstorm. I think one type of panel that I had heard can withstand, up to golf ball sized hail. So they definitely have taken that into consideration in the manufacturing of them. But that's something to check too, is to see what the warranty of those panels that you're choosing is, and to see if that is covered. But they shouldn't, most of the time, shouldn't break in a hailstorm. Mm-hmm.
Nice. Another question, and I didn't think of this, but I would like to know as well. Do you have to have a smart meter when you're adding solar?
So that is a good question, and I am not quite sure. You have to have a digital meter of some kind. So it has to be some kind of digital bidirectional meter. I don't think it has to be specifically a smart meter,
Sure.
but that would be a question for your utility company, because not, if you have a co-op, not all of the co-ops have smart meters. Many of them have a digital meter. So again, a good question to ask and see if that's a requirement, and it's going to vary based on your specific situation.
Yeah. Elizabeth was wondering if you knew how far away from the house you could. I'm wondering if it's a shade thing. How far from the house can you put panels? My thought was, I don't know the number, but wouldn't it cost more with just equipment to get out there as well, right? I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, so it will, I don't have a specific number in mind, but I know I've been on some tours of some panels that were installed for a home and for their farm. And so it was located kind of up on a hill away from, a little bit away from the home and the farm. And it just required more digging to get it set up and then connected. So they had to, depending on where their meter was located too, they had to do a little bit of work to get that in the ground. So
Sure.
that might cost a little bit more on your installation end, but if it's worth it for you, then that's definitely, it's not necessarily a limiting factor. It's going to be a cost factor to keep in mind. Mm-hmm.
Greg had a kind of a surge question. So are the panels or the here I'm looking and I was writing them down so I could see them. The inverter. So are the panels or the inverter vulnerable to EMPs, those electromagnetic pulses? I remember is the panels didn't have circuits, but I don't. So they wouldn't be. But what do you think about that?
That is a great question, and I am not even going to pretend to know an answer. I
Yeah.
am not sure on that one. Yeah, something to look into for sure.
Yeah, I think I've heard that if anything with a circuit can be affected, but there's
Mm-hmm.
probably some surging ability you could probably add to your cost. But the panels, I remember thinking, oh, good, at least the panels would be safe because they're just harvesting sun. They're not circuited, so.
Right, and I'm not sure too much on all of the specifications with the, the combiner box, the inverters, what
Right.
things, and they've had add-ons with changes in electrical code and other things, so they may have done some extra protection on that side, but yeah. I'm not sure.
Nice. No, I agree. It's all so new. There's so much. This question I thought was interesting. Barbara is leaving a much older, really over 4,000 square foot home for a half the size, like a 2,000 square foot, but much more efficient as far as energy efficiency.
Mm-hmm.
How would she predict what she needed if she doesn't basically have a bill system to look at, or would you want to wait and look at that first?
Yeah, in that situation, especially if it's very different, I would wait at least a year in that new space to see what your electricity load is, because again, you really don't want to oversize it and then undersize it too. You know, you want to have a good handle. So if there were, even if there were previous owners and they had, you know, electricity data that they'd be willing to share, but still their lifestyle is going to be different than yours. So it's really, I'd caution without having that data, sizing that system.
Yeah. There's some more coming in. Our time is a little bit limited. How does cold weather affect solar systems?
So that's interesting. A lot of people think that, you know, the sunnier area you're in is the most ideal area. But in a lot of times, you know, the sunnier, hotter, drier areas, when those panels get to a certain temperature, if they get any hotter, their efficiency and their performance actually decreases. So just because you live in a colder climate doesn't necessarily mean that they're not going to perform at their best. Again, I don't have any specific numbers off the top of my head of limitations, but you know, I never would have thought necessarily that Illinois would be a great place for solar, but actually it's not too bad. So that's one thing to keep in mind. There is also a way that kind of go along with cold. You can predict the reduction in your panel output based on snow buildup. So in that modeling system I was using, you can account for that a little bit, and that'd be something to talk about with a solar installer too, because depending on how much snow you get, if it builds up, you know, and sticks around for a little while, that can reduce your panel performance as well. But again, all of these are just things to take into consideration and not necessarily, you know, something where you say, I have snowy weather, I can't have solar panels. That's definitely not the case.
Okay. What about this person has a lot of shade? Would it be a good option to use like a solar farm?
So it will depend
Yeah.
on your
I know.
location. And I will mention one thing we didn't talk about today, because this was already enough to pack into this presentation, is if you go through your site assessment and it turns out that your home and your site, your location really isn't suitable at all. You know, a roof mount's not going to work, a ground mount's not going to work. There are other options for still buying into solar projects. So there's something called community solar, which is like a subscription process where you don't physically have to have the solar panels on your property, but there's like a large area set aside where there's a large solar array that's developed, and then you pay into that system. So you're essentially subscribing to and helping to support that system, and then it's going to take credits off of your electricity bill. That's a really brief overview, but again, if your site isn't suitable, definitely look into community solar because you can subscribe to one of those systems and still be, you know, helping out in that way, but not having that direct solar on your home.
Excellent. I'm going to have to play co-host. We're going over a little farther, and there are some good questions. And I would ask those of you who've asked questions that you don't have an answer, if you'll notice Erin's email on that slide, that right at the bottom at illinois.edu, take note of that, write it down real quick, and send her these questions. And there's not so many that she can't reply to them, but right now we're out of time with our Zoom meeting time, and I don't want to. We could go on because I have questions too. So I have to too. Because every time you answer something, some new idea or thought comes up, right? So if those of you would be willing to send Erin your questions, she can return those to you. But I would like to thank everybody. I did have it in the chat for the evaluation. Rod, by the way, says excellent presentation. I don't know if he's gone or still here, but thank you. And then once the link is also there, so when it's closed captioned, you can re-listen to this and stop it and pause it and go, which is what I'm going to do because it was so full of good information. And then the link to the registration is there in the chat for next month's webinar. We are going to be moving to a monthly webinar from our weekly webinars now. So don't look for them weekly. But we are still out there, and we're preparing new ones through November, I believe. So thank you everyone so much. Erin, that was fantastic breakdown from brains like mine. And I thank you very much. So everyone have a wonderful rest of your week. And thanks again for tuning in. I appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Peggy.
Mhm.
Peggy, if you want to stop the recording.
I keep hitting it, but it's not.
It didn't let me record also, so you've got it.
Oh my gosh. Well, it's not.
No pressure.
Do you want, oh, I'm sitting here pushing it. Do you want to stop cloud recording?